Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal, financial, or professional psychological advice. Marriage and divorce laws are subject to state-specific statutes and judicial interpretations which change frequently. The trends and data discussed represent historical patterns and sociological observations, not predictions for any specific individual case. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with licensed legal counsel or certified financial planners regarding their unique personal circumstances. For decades, the American public has been fed a specific, almost comfortable lie about the nature of the nuclear family. We have been told that the divorce rate is a stagnant 50%, a coin flip that has remained unchanged since the disco era. But that statistic is not just outdated, it is dangerously misleading. In the last several years, the very foundation of American domestic life has undergone a tectonic shift. We are witnessing the emergence of what sociologists are calling a demographic divergence so profound it is rewriting the social contract. While divorce rates for younger generations are actually plummeting to historic lows, a different group is experiencing a literal explosion in marital dissolution. This is the phenomenon of the gray divorce, a movement where couples who have been married for 30, 40, or even 50 years are walking away from the finish line just as they reach it. Why are the people we expected to be the most stable suddenly the most volatile? And why are the younger generations, long accused of being non-committal, actually becoming the most maritally stable cohort in a century? Today, we are initiating a deep dive masterclass into the changing demographics of divorce in America, a phenomenon we will categorize under the lens of the 661 shifts. This is not a surface-level conversation about growing apart. This is a rigorous examination of how economic independence, the evolution of no-fault legal frameworks, and a radical reimagining of the self in the second half of life have created a perfect storm. We are going to dismantle the myths you think you know about who gets divorced and why. By the end of this series, you will understand the precise historical trends that have led us here, the potential outcomes for the American economy as trillions of dollars in marital assets are liquidated, and the case studies of specific demographic cohorts that are either thriving or struggling in this new landscape. If you believe you understand the American family, prepare to have your assumptions challenged by the data. This is the reality of the 661 shift, and it begins with a fundamental question. What happens to a society when the oldest and most stable among us decide that, until death do us part, is no longer a sustainable philosophy? To understand where we are going, we must first look at the radical transformation of the divorce landscape over the last half-century. Historically, divorce was a tool of the young. In the 1970s and 80s, the peak risk for divorce occurred within the first 7 to 10 years of marriage. This was the era of the 7-year itch, where young couples, often married in their early 20s, realized they were incompatible before their lives were fully integrated. However, the data from the last decade suggests a massive inversion. According to longitudinal studies from organizations like the Pew Research Center, the divorce rate for adults aged 50 and older has roughly doubled since the 1990s. For those over the age of 65, the rate has tripled. This is not just a statistical anomaly. It is a cultural revolution. Consider the case study of the post-parental transition. For generations, the departure of children from the home, the empty nest, was seen as a period of reconnection for couples. However, in the modern demographic shift, this transition has become a primary catalyst for dissolution. Women in particular are now more likely to initiate divorce in these later years. Unlike the 1950s, where a woman's financial survival was often tethered to her husband's pension or social security, the modern woman over 50 is more likely to have had a career, a 401k, and the professional confidence to envision a life of independence. The potential outcomes of this shift are massive, affecting everything from real estate markets to healthcare delivery. When a couple in their late 60s divorces, they are no longer selling a starter home. They are liquidating a primary residence, perhaps a vacation home, and splitting retirement accounts that were intended to support one household, not two. This brings us to the marriage gap, a demographic divide that is increasingly defined by socioeconomic status and education. In the 21st century, marriage has become a luxury good. We are seeing a distinct trend where individuals with a college degree and higher income levels are significantly more likely to stay married than those without. This is a reversal of historical trends. In the mid-20th century, marriage was the universal baseline for adulthood across all classes. Today it is a capstone. People are waiting longer to get married, often until they have established their careers and financial stability. Consequently, when they do marry, they are older, more mature, and more financially resilient. This has led to a fascinating potential outcome: the Divorce 661 effect, where the overall divorce rate appears to be falling or stabilizing, but that stability is concentrated at the top of the economic ladder. Meanwhile, for those in lower-income demographics, the pressures are mounting. Economic instability is one of the most consistent predictors of marital dissolution. When we look at the historical trends of the last 20 years, we see that the decline of the manufacturing sector and the rise of the gig economy have placed unprecedented stress on working-class families. In these communities, divorce is often not a choice of self-fulfillment, but a byproduct of systemic financial strain. We will be exploring how the cost of living, the burden of student debt, and the lack of a social safety net are effectively pricing millions of Americans out of the stable marriage demographic. We must also analyze the legal evolution that has facilitated these changes. The shift from fault to no-fault divorce was only the beginning. Today, we are seeing the rise of collaborative divorce and mediation as the preferred methods for the 661 demographic. These methods prioritize the preservation of assets and the reduction of conflict, recognizing that in a gray divorce, the legal battle isn't just about who gets the kids, it's about who gets the pension, the healthcare coverage, and the legacy. We will examine case studies of how high-net-worth individuals are utilizing prenuptial and postnuptial agreements to navigate these waters, and why these documents are no longer just for the rich and famous, but are becoming essential tools for anyone entering a second or third marriage later in life. The promise of this deep dive is to provide you with the framework to navigate this shifting reality. Whether you are a younger individual looking at the declining divorce rates of your peers with hope, or someone in the midst of a later life transition, understanding these demographic levers is crucial. We are moving away from a one-size-fits-all narrative of American divorce and into a nuanced, bifurcated reality. Over the next 9 parts of this masterclass, we will examine the psychological impact of the long-term split, the math behind late-stage asset division, and the sociological reasons why the American I do is being redefined in real time. We will look at how technology and dating apps are influencing the divorce rates of the elderly, and how the concept of social capital is the new currency in post-divorce recovery. This is not just a study of endings. It is a study of how Americans are radically reevaluating the value of their time, their money, and their autonomy. The 661 shift is here, and it is changing everything we thought we knew about the American heartland. To truly grasp the magnitude of the 661 shift, we have to look at the historical trends that brought us to this specific moment in 2026. For the last 50 years, the American public has operated under a set of assumptions that were forged in the social upheavals of the late 1960s and 70s. During that era, the primary driver of marital dissolution was the liberation of the individual from traditional societal constraints. But in 2026, the drivers have become far more mechanical, economic, and demographic. We are no longer just looking at a cultural shift, we are looking at a mathematical one. The 661 demographic profile refers to a specific subset of the population where the intersection of age, asset accumulation, and life expectancy creates a unique pressure point that older generations simply never faced. Imagine if you are David, a 64-year-old project manager living in suburban Ohio in early 2026. David married Susan in the mid-1980s. They followed the traditional American script. They bought a home, raised 2 children, and diligently contributed to their respective 401k plans. For 35 years, their marriage was the stable center of their universe. However, as David approaches the threshold of retirement, he is confronted with a reality his own parents couldn't have imagined. In 1976, if a man David's age divorced, he was looking at perhaps 10 years of independent life, often with limited social support. In 2026, David is looking at a potential 30-year horizon. Medical advancements and a shift in the perception of aging mean that 65 is no longer the end of the road. It is the beginning of a third act that could last as long as his entire professional career. This longevity creates a massive incentive for what we call the late-stage reevaluation. David looks at Susan and realizes that while they are compatible co-parents, they are no longer compatible life partners for a 30-year retirement journey. This is a primary driver of the gray divorce explosion. Historical trends show that as life expectancy increases, the tolerance for a mediocre marriage decreases. When you have 3 decades of active life left, the cost of staying in an unfulfilling relationship becomes exponentially higher. This is one of the potential outcomes of the 661 shift, a surge in late-life divorces driven not by crisis, but by the sheer volume of time remaining. Now, compare David's situation to Marcus and Chloe, a millennial couple in their mid-30s living in 2026. Marcus and Chloe represent the opposite end of the demographic spectrum. They waited until their early 30s to marry, a trend that has become the standard in the United States over the last decade. Before they walked down the aisle, they lived together for 5 years, effectively conducting a half-decade beta test of their compatibility. They have navigated a pandemic, multiple economic fluctuations, and the complexities of dual career management before ever signing a legal document. Because they entered the marriage with a high degree of economic fusion and emotional maturity, their statistical risk of divorce is actually lower than any generation before them. The demographic data suggests that the 661 shift is creating a massive gap in the American heartland. On one side, you have older couples who are dismantling decades of shared history. On the other, you have younger couples who are building highly resilient, almost corporate-style partnerships that are designed to withstand significant external pressure. This leads us to a crucial case study in the 661 shift, the role of the prenuptial mediation. In 2026, the stigma surrounding prenuptial agreements has largely evaporated, especially among high-earning professionals. Imagine if Marcus and Chloe, during their engagement, sat down not just to plan a wedding, but to map out the potential outcomes of their financial future. They utilized mediation to decide how their assets would be handled if the marriage were to end. This isn't seen as a lack of trust, but as a form of insurance. In the 661 landscape, this level of pragmatic planning is becoming a hallmark of the modern marriage. It effectively removes the financial incentive or fear that often kept previous generations trapped in unhappy unions. But we must also address the economic mechanics of the split in 2026. The division of assets has moved beyond just the house and the car. We are now dealing with complex portfolios that include digital assets, intellectual property, and varying degrees of remote work-related home equity. Step by step, the process of a 2026 divorce involves a forensic level of detail that was rare 20 years ago. For a couple like David and Susan, the dissolution involves splitting a pension that was built on a 40-year career, managing the tax implications of liquidating long-term investments, and deciding the fate of a family home that has tripled in value since they purchased it. The historical trends of the last decade show that women in the 661 demographic are increasingly the ones to initiate the split. This is often because women have become more financially literate and independent than previous generations of wives. In 2026, a woman Susan's age is more likely to have her own professional network and a clear understanding of her Social Security benefits. The fear of being a destitute divorcee, which was a very real deterrent in the mid-20th century, has been mitigated by decades of professional participation. However, the potential outcomes for men in this demographic can be quite different. Data suggests that men over 60 often struggle more with the social isolation that follows a divorce. While a woman may have a robust social circle to lean on, a man of David's generation often found his social life mediated through his wife. When the marriage ends, he doesn't just lose a partner, he often loses his entire social infrastructure. This is a hidden demographic cost of the 661 shift that is rarely discussed in the headlines. Furthermore, we have to consider the impact of the sandwich generation in 2026. These are the individuals who are simultaneously caring for aging parents and supporting adult children, who may still be struggling with the high cost of living. When a divorce occurs in this group, the shockwaves travel up and down the family tree. The financial resources that were supposed to be the safety net for the entire family are suddenly halved. Imagine the pressure on a 55-year-old woman who is trying to navigate her own divorce while managing her mother's assisted living costs and her son's graduate school tuition. In the 2026 landscape, divorce is never an isolated event. It is a systemic disruption. As we move through this masterclass, we will see that the 661 shift is defined by this complexity. We are no longer in an era where divorce is a simple binary choice. It is a multidimensional negotiation involving time, wealth, and the very definition of family. The trends are clear. We are seeing a great sorting where some marriages are becoming more durable than ever, while others, once thought to be permanent, are dissolving with surprising speed. If the 661 shift is driven by a radical reevaluation of time and autonomy, what happens when that reevaluation meets the cold, hard reality of the modern legal system? How are the courts in 2026 adapting to a world where a 60-year-old man might be ordered to pay alimony for a duration that could last longer than his actual marriage? And what about the emergence of the gray divorce poverty trap, where the division of assets leaves both parties unable to maintain the lifestyle they worked 40 years to build? In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the dark side of the silver splitter. We will examine the specific financial pitfalls that are catching the 661 demographic off guard, and the rise of a new legal industry designed specifically to handle the complexities of the late-stage split. We will also explore the surprising role that technology and the new era of connectivity are playing in both breaking and making the modern American family. Stay tuned, because the numbers we are about to uncover will change how you view your own financial and marital future. The financial reality of the 661 shift is perhaps most visible when we look at the math of the split. In the United States of 2026, the economic fallout of a late-stage divorce is no longer just a private family matter. It is a macroeconomic event. When a couple like Robert and Linda, who have been married for 38 years, decides to dissolve their union, they aren't just dividing a bank account. They are dismantling a complex, multi-layered financial ecosystem that was never designed to be partitioned. Historical trends show that for many couples over the age of 60, the primary residence represents more than 60% of their total net worth. In a 2026 housing market, where inventory remains tight and interest rates have reached a new structural plateau, the decision to sell the family home is fraught with peril. Imagine Robert and Linda sitting in a sterile conference room in mid-2026. They are looking at a spreadsheet that represents their life's work. The house, purchased in the late 90s for $300,000, is now appraised at $1.2 million. On paper, they are wealthy, but the potential outcomes of selling that asset are staggering. After paying off the remaining mortgage, realtor commissions, and the significant capital gains taxes that apply to the portion of the profit exceeding the federal exclusion limit, they are left with a sum that, when split in two, is insufficient for either of them to purchase a comparable home in their current neighborhood. This is the first trap of the silver splitter: the loss of the primary asset's utility. Suddenly, two people who lived in a 4-bedroom house are looking at moving into 1-bedroom apartments, a radical downgrade in lifestyle that neither anticipated when they first discussed parting ways. Beyond real estate, the 661 shift forces a brutal confrontation with the reality of healthcare. In 2026, the cost of medical care continues to outpace general inflation, making it the single largest variable in retirement planning. Consider the case study of a spouse who has been covered under their partner's employer-sponsored plan for decades. Upon divorce, that coverage evaporates. While COBRA is an option, the premiums in 2026 for a 62-year-old individual can exceed $1,500 a month. If that individual is not yet eligible for Medicare, they are forced into the individual marketplace. The step-by-step reality of this transition involves navigating complex subsidy cliffs and deductible structures that can consume a massive portion of their newly halved income. For many in the 661 demographic, the divorce decree is not just a legal document. It is a healthcare crisis in waiting. Then there is the issue of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or the QDRO. This is the legal mechanism used to divide retirement assets like 401ks and traditional pensions. In the 2026 legal landscape, the QDRO has become a specialized field of its own. Historical trends indicate that errors in these documents are one of the leading causes of post-divorce litigation. Imagine the complexity of a pension that has been earning credit since 1988. How do you account for the survivor benefits? How do you factor in the cost of living adjustments that were negotiated 10 years ago? The potential outcomes of a poorly drafted QDRO can mean the difference between a comfortable retirement and one defined by scarcity. We are seeing the rise of financial neutrals, professionals who are neither lawyers nor therapists, but forensic accountants whose sole job is to ensure that the 661 split doesn't trigger an accidental tax disaster. We must also examine the emerging phenomenon of the digital asset minefield. In 2026, a couple's portfolio often includes more than just stocks and bonds. There are cryptocurrency holdings, non-fungible tokens, and even monetized social media accounts or digital storefronts. Step by step, the discovery process in a 2026 divorce now includes a digital audit. Imagine if Robert had a secret stash of Bitcoin or a high-value collection of digital collectibles that Linda was only vaguely aware of. The legal system is still racing to catch up with how to value and divide these volatile assets. We are seeing case studies where the division of a boring index fund is simple. But the argument over a shared YouTube channel or a high-traffic blog becomes the primary point of contention. Technology is not just complicating the division of assets, it is actively accelerating the rate of dissolution itself. In 2026, the barriers to finding a new social or romantic life have been completely dismantled by AI-driven connectivity. For a generation that grew up without the internet, the sudden accessibility of long-lost high school sweethearts via social media or highly curated dating apps for the over 60 crowd is a powerful disruptor. Historical trends suggest that the what-if factor is a major driver of the 661 shift. When a person in a 30-year marriage feels a sense of stagnation, they no longer have to wonder what else is out there. They can see it in high definition on their phone screen. This creates a psychological pull that makes the friction of a long-term marriage feel unbearable by comparison. But let's look closer at the gendered economic impact. Data from 2026 shows a persistent divorce gap in terms of post-split standard of living. While we've noted that more women are initiating divorce, the potential outcomes for their long-term wealth are often more precarious. Statistically, women over 60 who divorce see their standard of living drop by nearly 45%, while men see a drop of only 21%. This is often due to the cumulative effect of the caregiving penalty, years spent out of the workforce or in part-time roles to raise children or care for aging parents. In the 661 demographic, these lost years of compound interest and Social Security credits cannot be recovered. Case studies show that women in this group are increasingly forced back into the labor market at age 65 or 70, not because they want to work, but because the math of the split demands it. In response to these complexities, a new legal industry has emerged in the United States. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of the divorce coach and the senior divorce concierge. These are professionals who guide the 661 demographic through the logistical nightmare of starting over. From finding new housing that accommodates aging in place to setting up independent credit histories for spouses who always relied on their partner's accounts, the process is granular. It is a total rebuilding of an identity that was submerged in a partnership for most of their adult life. The 661 shift is a story of liberation for many, but it is also a story of extreme vulnerability. As we see more and more Americans choose this path, the ripple effects are touching every part of our society, from the way we design retirement communities to the way we legislate Social Security benefits. The myth of the happily ever after is being replaced by the reality of the intermittently ever after. People are prioritizing the quality of their remaining years over the longevity of their past commitments. But what happens to the next generation in this scenario? We often think of divorce as a problem for small children, but in the 661 shift, the children are often in their 30s and 40s. How does a late-stage divorce impact the inheritance of the American middle class? What happens when the bank of mom and dad suddenly closes because mom and dad are paying for two separate households and two separate legal teams? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to dive into the collateral damage of the 661 shift. We will explore how the dissolution of long-term marriages is fundamentally altering the transfer of wealth in America, and why the adult children of divorce are the silent victims of this new demographic trend. We'll look at the data on how family legacies are being rewritten, and the surprising way that a 2026 divorce can impact the college funds of grandchildren who haven't even been born yet. The economic shockwaves are just beginning. When we talk about the economic shockwaves of a late-stage divorce in 2026, we are often too focused on the two people signing the papers. We forget about the third party in this transaction, the adult children. For decades, the American middle class has operated on the assumption of a linear transfer of wealth. The parents build the equity, and the children eventually inherit the foundation. But the 661 shift is effectively detonating this bridge. In the United States of 2026, we are seeing the emergence of the inheritance cliff. This is a phenomenon where the assets intended to support the next generation are liquidated to fund the sudden, late-life independence of the previous one. Imagine a character named James. James is 36 years old, living in a high-cost area like Austin, Texas, in mid-2026. For years, James has worked a stable corporate job, but like many of his peers, he has been priced out of the housing market. His parents, who have been married for 42 years, had always told him that their home, a fully paid-off property in a desirable suburb, would be his eventually, or at the very least, would provide the collateral for his own down payment. But as his parents enter the 661 demographic shift and decide to divorce, that promise evaporates in real time. Step by step, the liquidation process begins. To achieve an equitable distribution of assets, the family home must be sold. In the 2026 market, this generates a significant sum, but that sum is immediately split in two. James's father, needing to establish a new household at age 68, uses his half to buy a smaller condo and pay for the high cost of individual health insurance premiums. James's mother, also needing a fresh start, invests her half into a managed living facility that provides the long-term security she no longer feels she has with a partner. The $200,000 down payment assistance that James was counting on is no longer a line item in their budget. It has been consumed by the mechanical necessity of maintaining two separate lives instead of one. This is not an isolated case study. It is becoming a dominant historical trend. In 2026, the bank of mom and dad is effectively going through a forced bankruptcy. When we look at the data, we see that the percentage of first-time homebuyers receiving financial help from family has dropped significantly in areas with high late-stage divorce rates. The potential outcomes for the next generation are profound. We are looking at a delay in family formation, a decrease in homeownership rates for 30-somethings, and a fundamental shift in how millennials and Gen Z view their own financial security. They are learning, often painfully, that the generational wealth they were told to expect is far more fragile than they realized. Now, consider the educational impact, specifically through the lens of the 529 College Savings Plan. In many 2026 divorce cases, these accounts are caught in a legal gray area. Imagine if James has a daughter, Emily, who is 10 years old. Her grandparents had been contributing to a 529 plan for her for a decade. However, during the divorce proceedings, that account, depending on how it was structured, might be viewed as a marital asset. If the grandparents are struggling to fund their separate retirements, there is an increasing trend of these accounts being raided, or at the very least, the contributions being halted. The potential outcome is a massive shortfall for the grandchildren's education, creating a ripple effect of student debt that will persist well into the 2040s. But the 661 shift doesn't just take away financial resources. It adds a massive caregiving burden. Let's look at another case study. Sarah, a 40-year-old nurse in 2026. Her parents, after 35 years of marriage, have decided to split. Previously, her parents were a self-contained care unit. When her father had a minor surgery, her mother was there to manage the recovery. When her mother struggled with mobility, her father handled the household chores. They were an efficient two-person team. Post-divorce, Sarah is now the primary support system for two separate households. Instead of one trip to the grocery store or one weekend visit, her labor is doubled. In the 2026 economy, where time is the most valuable and scarce commodity, this caregiving tax is a silent killer of productivity and mental health. Sarah is now navigating two different medical histories, two different sets of home maintenance needs, and two different emotional crises. The data shows that adult children of late-stage divorce are twice as likely to report high levels of caregiver burnout compared to those whose parents remain together. This is the hidden labor cost of the 661 shift. Furthermore, we must address the complex reality of estate planning in 2026. The legal industry has seen a massive surge in the need for trust reformation. Imagine a family that established a revocable living trust in 2015, designed to pass their assets seamlessly to their children. A late-stage divorce effectively shatters this document. The step-by-step process of untangling a decade-old trust is a legal minefield. It requires new valuations of all assets, the resignation of trustees, and the drafting of entirely new beneficiary designations. In many cases, the original intent of the wealth, to stay within the family, is compromised. We are seeing an increase in case studies where one parent remarries quickly, and through lack of careful planning, a significant portion of the family's legacy ends up being diverted to a new spouse or stepchildren. This creates a level of intergenerational resentment that can tear families apart for decades. In 2026, the conversation around the dinner table isn't just about who gets the heirloom watch. It's about why the family's land was sold to pay for a father's new lifestyle in a different state. This leads us to a broader sociological observation. The 661 shift is redefining the American concept of legacy. For over a century, the goal of the American dream was to leave your children better off than you were. But in 2026, the focus has shifted toward individual fulfillment in the final third of life. This is not necessarily a selfish act, but it is a radical departure from the collectivist family mindset of the past. The data indicates that we are moving toward a society where the individual's current quality of life is prioritized over the future stability of the lineage. The economic shockwaves we are discussing are not just about numbers on a page. They are about the fundamental reorganization of American society. When the elders of a tribe decide to split their resources and their attention, the entire structure of the tribe changes. The 661 shift is a signal that the traditional multi-generational safety net is being replaced by a fragmented, individualistic model. This model offers more freedom for the parents, but it places significantly more risk on the children and grandchildren. As we continue this masterclass, we have to ask, if the financial and logistical costs are this high, why is the rate of these divorces continuing to climb in 2026? What is the psychological catalyst that makes a 65-year-old decide that the destruction of their financial legacy is a price worth paying for a new beginning? We are starting to see patterns in the data that point toward a psychological contagion effect, where the visibility of these late-stage splits is making them more socially acceptable, and therefore more likely to occur. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the social psychology of the 661 shift. We will examine how the 2026 media landscape and the rise of self-actualization influencers are specifically targeting the over 60 demographic. We will look at the case studies of second adolescence and the surprising way that social media algorithms are creating echo chambers that encourage marital dissolution as a form of personal growth. We'll also uncover the data on the regret factor. What happens 2 years after the 661 split? Is the grass truly greener? Or are we witnessing a massive demographic miscalculation? The answers are found in the psychological data, and they are not what you expect. To understand the psychological data behind the 661 shift, we must first look at the digital environment of 2026. For a character like Margaret, a 63-year-old retired educator in Virginia, the path to divorce often begins not in the bedroom or at the kitchen table, but on her smartphone. In 2026, the media landscape has matured into a highly segmented machine that specifically targets the over 60 demographic with narratives of radical self-actualization. Historical trends show that the midlife crisis has shifted significantly later into the lifespan, becoming what sociologists now call the late life reboot. Imagine Margaret scrolling through her feed. The algorithms, which have spent years mapping her interests, begin to serve her a consistent stream of content from silver reboot influencers. These are individuals in their 60s and 70s who document their lives post-divorce, showcasing international travel, new fitness regimens, and a level of vibrancy that stands in stark contrast to Margaret's quiet, predictable domestic life. This creates a psychological phenomenon known as relative deprivation. Margaret isn't necessarily unhappy, but she is being shown a version of better that makes her good feel like stagnant. This is the first step in the 661 psychological shift, the erosion of contentment. Step by step, the algorithm reinforces the idea that her marriage is the primary anchor preventing her from achieving this idealized version of herself. This isn't a get-rich-quick scheme, but a get-happy-quick narrative that relies on the potential outcomes of a complete lifestyle overhaul. By mid-2026, Margaret is no longer comparing her marriage to her own past. She is comparing it to a curated, digital future. This leads directly into the second adolescence. In 2026, the psychological profile of the 661 demographic mirrors that of a teenager in several key ways. There is a heightened focus on the self, a rejection of long-standing authority or tradition, and a pursuit of dopamine-heavy novelty. Case studies from psychological journals in 2025 and 2026 suggest that the 661 rebirth is often accompanied by a biological surge in dopamine seekers. When a 67-year-old man like Gary, a former corporate executive, decides to leave a 40-year marriage, he often experiences a dopamine high, associated with the novelty of a new apartment, new technology, and a new social circle. However, the data reveals a much darker reality beneath this initial surge. This is where we must examine the regret factor. While the first 12 months post-divorce, often called the honeymoon phase of autonomy, are characterized by high levels of reported satisfaction, the trend lines begin to invert sharply around the 24 to 36-month mark. This is a phenomenon we call the third-year wall. In 2026, we have enough longitudinal data to see that for a significant portion of the 661 demographic, the potential outcomes of late-life divorce are often defined by a crushing sense of social isolation. Imagine Gary 3 years into his new life. The novelty of his bachelor pad has worn off. He has realized that his new friends were mostly event friends, and they lacked the deep shared history of his former social circle, which was tied to his marriage. When Gary experiences a minor health scare in late 2026, he finds that his support system is transactional rather than relational. He has to hire a patient advocate or a home health aide because he no longer has a partner to provide the informal, high-trust care that a long-term spouse offers. Step by step, the psychological realization sets in. He has traded deep history for broad novelty. The data on divorce remorse in the 661 group shows that while only 15% of younger divorcees regret their decision, that number jumps to nearly 35% for those who divorce after age 60. The reasons are consistently the same: the loss of shared legacy, the fragmentation of relationships with adult children, and the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a solo life in an economy designed for dual-income households. We also have to consider the friend group contagion effect, which has reached a fever pitch in 2026. Psychological studies indicate that divorce is socially contagious. If a couple in a close-knit friend group of 4 couples decides to divorce, the statistical likelihood of the other 3 couples divorcing within 5 years increases by 75%. This is because the divorce of 661 provides a proof of concept for the others. When Margaret sees her friend Linda thriving post-split, it lowers the psychological barrier to her own exit. It normalizes what was once unthinkable. This creates a feedback loop where the 661 shift becomes self-sustaining within specific social cohorts. But what about the role of artificial intelligence in this psychological shift? In 2026, AI companions and relationship coaches have become mainstream. Many individuals in the 661 demographic are using AI bots to simulate the conversations they wish they were having with their spouses. The potential outcome is a validation loop, where the AI, programmed to be agreeable and supportive, confirms the user's biases. If Margaret tells her AI coach that she feels unseen in her marriage, the AI doesn't challenge her or suggest marital counseling. It provides empowerment scripts that encourage her to choose herself. This digital echo chamber is a primary driver of the speed at which 661 divorces are now occurring. The psychological data also points toward a sunk cost inversion. In the past, the sunk cost fallacy kept people together. They felt they had invested too much time to leave. In 2026, the 661 demographic is applying time utility theory. They look at the 20 years they likely have left and decide that those years are more valuable than the 40 years they've already spent. They aren't trying to save the past. They are trying to optimize the remainder. This shift in perspective is revolutionary. It changes the goal of the final third of life from stability to optimization. But as the case studies of Gary and Margaret show, optimization is a moving target. The psychological price of this pursuit often includes a permanent rift with adult children who feel their parents are being reckless or self-absorbed. In 2026, we are seeing a surge in family reconciliation therapy, specifically designed to handle the anger that 30-something children feel toward their silver splitter parents. The children aren't just upset about the money. They are grieving the loss of the family home as a psychological sanctuary. The 661 shift is a story of a generation that has been told they can have it all well into their 80s. But the data from 2026 suggests that while they can have newness, they cannot have continuity at the same time. The trade-off is absolute. As we move into the next phase of this masterclass, we have to look at the physical consequences of this psychological stress. Because the mind and the body are not separate, and the 661 split is having a documented biological impact on the health of the American elderly. How does the stress of a late-stage divorce physically age the brain and the cardiovascular system? What is the broken heart syndrome data telling us about the mortality rates of the 661 demographic in the 5 years following a split? And most importantly, is there a way to achieve the optimization Margaret and Gary crave without the destruction of their historical foundations? In the next part, we dive into the biodemographics of divorce. We will look at the startling connection between marital status and life expectancy in 2026 and uncovering the health-wealth gap that is widening for every single person going through a late life split. The biological clock is ticking, and the 661 shift is winding it faster than ever before. The biological reality of the 661 shift is a story written in cortisol and telomeres. When we look at the data from early 2026, we see that the physiological impact of a late-stage divorce is not just a temporary state of distress. It is a fundamental recalibration of the body's aging process. To understand this, we need to look at the case study of Thomas, a 67-year-old retired architect living in Phoenix. Thomas and his wife of 34 years decided to part ways in late 2025. On the surface, Thomas felt a sense of relief. He moved into a modern apartment, started a new exercise routine, and felt he was finally prioritizing his own needs. However, his biological markers told a different story. Step by step, the physiological toll began to manifest. In the 2026 medical landscape, we use advanced biometric tracking to monitor the impact of life stressors. For Thomas, the sudden loss of a co-regulator, someone whose presence helped stabilize his circadian rhythms and blood pressure for decades, triggered a chronic elevation in his baseline cortisol levels. Historical trends in geriatric medicine suggest that when a long-term partner is removed from the immediate environment, the remaining spouse often experiences a disruption in sleep architecture. Thomas found himself entering the REM cycle less frequently, leading to a decrease in the body's ability to clear metabolic waste from the brain. In the 661 demographic, this isn't just about being tired. It is a potential outcome that accelerates cognitive decline. We must also examine the concept of biological age versus chronological age. Data from 2026 indicates that individuals going through a 661 split often age biologically by 3 to 5 years during the first 18 months of the process. This is measured through telomere attrition, the shortening of the protective caps on our chromosomes. Imagine if every legal deposition, every argument over the division of the 401k, and every night spent in an empty house was a physical weight on Thomas's cellular structure. The stress of the 661 shift acts as a catalyst for cellular senescence. Case studies show that the inflammatory markers in newly divorced seniors are significantly higher than those of their married peers. This chronic inflammation is the silent driver of the health-wealth gap. The health-wealth gap in 2026 is the intersection where financial depletion meets physical degradation. Imagine if Patricia, a 62-year-old woman in Chicago, is navigating the same 661 shift. After the assets are split, Patricia finds herself with significantly less liquidity than she anticipated. To compensate, she begins to make small, seemingly insignificant changes to her lifestyle. She opts for lower quality, processed foods because they are cheaper and easier to prepare for one person. She delays her biannual dental cleaning and skips a specialist consultation for her joint pain to save on co-pays. Step by step, these micro-decisions, driven by the economic reality of the split, lead to a macro decline in her health. In 2026, we call this the singlehood penalty in healthcare. In a dual-income married household, there is a natural system of checks and balances. One spouse notices the other's lingering cough. One spouse encourages the other to stay active. When that system is dismantled, the individual is left to self-monitor in a state of high stress. Historical trends show that divorced individuals over 60 are 40% more likely to miss early warning signs of cardiovascular disease. The potential outcome is a sudden, acute health event that could have been prevented with a partner's observation. Then there is the phenomenon of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, commonly known as broken heart syndrome. While the name sounds poetic, the clinical reality in 2026 is anything but. This is a condition where the heart muscle becomes suddenly weakened or stunned, often triggered by severe emotional or physical stress. In the 661 demographic, where the heart is already managing the natural effects of aging, the shock of a long-term marriage ending can be a literal strike to the cardiovascular system. We are seeing a documented rise in these cases among women over 65 who are blindsided by a divorce request. The sudden surge in adrenaline and stress hormones can lead to symptoms that mimic a heart attack, often requiring intensive care. But the data goes even deeper into the social biology of the 661 shift. Loneliness in 2026 has been classified as a greater public health threat than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. For someone like Thomas, the loss of his wife also meant the loss of his primary social gatekeeper. In many American households, the woman manages the social calendar and maintains the connections with friends and family. Post-divorce, many men in the 661 demographic find themselves in a social vacuum. This isolation isn't just a psychological burden, it is a biological one. Case studies show that social isolation triggers the same neural pathways as physical pain. It weakens the immune system, making the individual more susceptible to everything from the common flu to more serious infections. This brings us to the mortality gap. Historical trends from the last decade indicate that divorced men over 60 have a higher mortality rate than their married counterparts. The reasons are multifaceted, ranging from poor nutrition and lack of medical compliance to the aforementioned cardiovascular strain. In 2026, the data suggests that for a man in the 661 demographic, staying in a mediocre but stable marriage might actually be a more viable health strategy than seeking a new beginning that comes with high physiological costs. This is a hard truth that the self-actualization influencers often omit. Step by step, the 661 shift is creating a new class of vulnerable seniors. These are people who are financially stable on paper but biologically fragile. Imagine if the cost of the divorce isn't just the $50,000 in legal fees, but also 5 years of life expectancy. In the United States of 2026, where the healthcare system is already strained, the influx of newly single, aging individuals with complex health needs is a looming crisis. We are seeing the rise of divorce-sensitive healthcare, where providers are trained to recognize the specific biometric signatures of late-life marital stress. The promise of the 661 shift is autonomy, but the biological reality is often dependency on a healthcare system that is becoming increasingly expensive. For Thomas and Patricia, the optimization they sought in their personal lives has led to an optimization of their medical charts, but not in the direction they hoped. They are learning that the body keeps the score of the divorce decree. But what if there was a way to mitigate these risks? What if the 661 shift is also giving rise to new forms of communal living and social support that could actually improve longevity? As we move into the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the rise of the silver communes. We will examine how the 661 demographic is rejecting the traditional solo bachelor or solo spinster model and instead creating radical new social structures. We will explore the data on co-housing for divorcees, the emergence of platonic life partnerships, and how the 2026 tech landscape is facilitating a complete reimagining of the American household. Is it possible that the destruction of the nuclear family at the age of 65 is actually the catalyst for a more resilient, community-based future? Or are these just temporary patches on a fundamentally broken social fabric? In the next part, we look at the architecture of the new beginning. We will dive into how the 661 shift is literally changing the floor plans of American homes and the social contracts of our neighborhoods. The way we live together is being rewritten, and the results are nothing short of revolutionary. Stay tuned because the next chapter of the 661 shift is where the future of American society is actually being built. The 661 shift is not just dismantling the traditional American family, it is physically deconstructing the American neighborhood as we know it in 2026. For the last 70 years, the suburbs of the United States were designed for one specific demographic unit: the nuclear family. The 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a 2-car garage was the architectural manifestation of a lifetime commitment. But as the 661 demographic, those entering the third act of life and choosing dissolution over stagnation, continues to grow, we are witnessing the death of the McMansion and the birth of a radical new housing market. Historical trends indicate that the supply of large suburban homes is beginning to outpace demand as 661 divorcees liquidate their primary assets, creating a structural shift in real estate that developers are only now beginning to navigate. Imagine Cynthia, a 66-year-old former interior designer in North Carolina. In early 2026, Cynthia finalized her divorce after 39 years of marriage. Her primary asset was a 4,000 square foot home in a gated community. In the 2026 market, trying to maintain that property alone is not just a financial burden. It is an architectural mismatch for her new life. The potential outcomes for Cynthia are limited by traditional real estate models, leading her to participate in what we now call the Great Downsizing Pivot. Step by step, Cynthia engages in a process of asset liquidation that triggers a ripple effect through her local economy. She sells the large family home to a younger multi-generational family, perhaps a pair of millennials with their own aging parents, and moves into a specifically designed 661 micro-community. These micro-communities are the architectural response to the 661 shift. In 2026, we are seeing a surge in the construction of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, and what urban planners call pocket neighborhoods. These are clusters of smaller, high-end homes centered around a shared commons. For Cynthia, this isn't a retirement home in the traditional clinical sense. It is a strategically designed environment that provides the autonomy she craves while mitigating the biological risks of isolation we discussed previously. These homes are equipped with 2026 standard AI health monitoring, modular furniture that adapts to changing mobility needs, and social contracts that prioritize communal resource sharing. Case studies from early 2026 in states like Oregon and California show that these communities are becoming the preferred destination for the silver splitter. But the shift goes deeper than just moving into a smaller house. We are seeing the rise of platonic co-living. Imagine if Cynthia doesn't buy a new home at all. Instead, she and two other divorced women in their 60s decide to merge their remaining assets to purchase a single, large property. This is the 2026 reality of the Golden Girls 2.0. This isn't just a lifestyle choice. It is a sophisticated financial and legal maneuver. They draft a cohabitation agreement that functions like a corporate charter, detailing the division of expenses, the management of shared spaces, and the exit strategy should one of them remarry or require professional nursing care. Historical trends suggest that this model of chosen family is providing a more stable economic foundation than the solo dweller model, as it allows for the pooling of high-cost services like housekeeping, landscaping, and private security. Then there is the boomerang divorcee phenomenon. In a total reversal of the early 2000s trend where adult children moved back into their parents' basements, 2026 is seeing a massive wave of parents moving into their children's homes following a 661 split. Let's look at a case study involving Michael, a 69-year-old who found himself financially vulnerable after his divorce settlement. Instead of struggling to maintain an independent apartment on half of his former pension, Michael moves into an ADU built in the backyard of his daughter's home in Austin, Texas. The potential outcomes here are complex. While this provides Michael with a built-in support system and reduces his cost of living, it places an immense intergenerational friction on the middle-aged children. Step by step, the family must renegotiate boundaries. Who pays for the increased utility bills? Does Michael have a say in the parenting of his grandchildren? In 2026, the rise of multi-generational mediation is a direct result of the 661 shift. Families are hiring professional mediators to draft family living charters that prevent the emotional fallout that often accompanies these forced consolidations. We must also consider the impact on the retirement destination states. Places like Florida and Arizona, which built their entire economies on the concept of married couples retiring together, are facing a demographic reckoning. In 2026, the demand for couples-only luxury condos is softening, while the demand for single-occupancy, high-service rentals is skyrocketing. Real estate investment trusts are pivoting their portfolios away from traditional senior living and toward ageless urbanism. This involves developing high-density, walkable neighborhoods in city centers where 661 divorcees can access culture, transit, and social nodes without the burden of car ownership or yard maintenance. The data from mid-2026 shows that 661 divorcees are the primary drivers of the new rental revolution in the over 60 demographic. They are choosing liquidity over equity. After decades of being house-rich and cash-poor, they are using the proceeds from their divorce sales to fund a lifestyle defined by experiences rather than maintenance. This has led to the emergence of the leaseback model, where a 661 individual sells their home to an investment firm and leases it back for a fixed term, allowing them to unlock their equity without the immediate trauma of moving. However, the architecture of the 661 shift isn't just about where people sleep. It's about the digital infrastructure that connects them. In 2026, neighborhood operating systems are becoming common. These are localized digital platforms that allow 661 individuals to trade time credits. For example, Michael might spend 2 hours tutoring a neighbor's child in exchange for a ride to the specialist's office or help with a complex tech issue. This circular economy of care is the invisible architecture that makes the 661 shift sustainable. It replaces the lost domestic labor of a spouse with the distributed labor of a community. But as the physical world adapts to these new solo living and co-living models, a new conflict is brewing in the legal and financial halls of power. The 661 shift is forcing a radical reevaluation of the American tax code and social security system. If the household is no longer defined by a marriage license, how do we allocate benefits? What happens when three platonic partners want to be recognized as a single economic unit for insurance purposes? We are moving into a period of high-stakes legal experimentation. If the architecture of our homes is changing to accommodate the 661 divorcee, what is happening to the architecture of our laws? How is the American legal system in 2026 responding to a world where alimony and support are being claimed by people who have already spent 40 years in the workforce? And what about the emergence of Social Security splitting? a trend that is threatening to bankrupt the very system designed to protect the elderly. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to dive into the legal battlefields of 2026. We will examine the specific, high-stakes court cases that are redefining the division of government benefits and the rise of post-marital advocacy groups. We'll look at the data on how the 661 shift is influencing legislative changes across the United States, and the surprising ways that your marital status at age 67 could dictate your tax bracket for the rest of your life. The fight for resources is getting personal, and the rules of the game are being rewritten as we speak. Stay tuned because the next chapter is where the true cost of autonomy is finally tallied. The legal landscape of 2026 has become the final arbiter of the 661 shift, turning the American courtroom into a theater of high-stakes financial engineering. As we enter the mid-2020s, the legal system is no longer just processing paperwork. It is attempting to solve a demographic math problem that the founding fathers of family law never anticipated. When a couple in the 661 demographic decides to dissolve a 40-year union, they aren't just filing for divorce. They are initiating a forensic deconstruction of the American social safety net. To understand the true cost of this autonomy, we have to look at the specific legal battlefields where the rules of retirement, taxation, and government benefits are being rewritten in real time. Imagine Barbara, a 67-year-old former librarian in Ohio, standing at the threshold of her new life in May 2026. Barbara and her husband, Richard, have been married since 1989. For decades, Barbara assumed her golden years were secured by Richard's high-earning career and the Social Security benefits that would naturally flow from their joint status. But in the 661 landscape, the legal mechanics of Social Security have become a primary point of contention. Under current federal guidelines in 2026, a divorced spouse can still claim benefits based on their ex-spouse's earnings record if the marriage lasted at least 10 years. However, the potential outcomes of this rule are becoming increasingly complex as the government looks for ways to stabilize the Social Security Trust Fund. Step by step, Barbara's legal team must navigate what is now known as the Divorced Spouse Benefit Audit. In 2026, the Social Security Administration has implemented more rigorous verification processes to prevent what some legislators call benefit dilution. Barbara is eligible for up to 50% of Richard's primary insurance amount, but only if she remains unmarried. This creates a legal and financial trap. If Barbara meets a new partner and decides to remarry, she loses that claim to Richard's higher benefit tier. Historical trends show that this specific regulation is driving a surge in what we call silver cohabitation, where 661 divorcees choose to live together without the legal bond of marriage simply to protect their government-derived income. The legal fight for resources is no longer just between the spouses. It is a strategic game played against the federal tax and benefit code. This brings us to the rise of gray alimony, a term that has taken on a new, more aggressive meaning in the 2026 court system. Historically, alimony was designed to bridge the gap for a spouse to become self-sufficient. But for the 661 demographic, there is no re-entering the workforce at age 68. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 show that judges are increasingly moving away from rehabilitative alimony and toward permanent maintenance in late-life splits. Imagine Richard, who is also nearing 70, being ordered to pay a significant portion of his fixed pension to Barbara for the rest of his life. In the 2026 economy, where inflation has eroded the purchasing power of traditional savings, this creates a situation where neither party can afford a standard of living that even remotely resembles their married life. We are seeing a documented increase in alimony modification filings, where aging ex-husbands return to court claiming that their own medical costs make the original support order a death sentence. Furthermore, we must address the 2026 tax trap for the newly single. The Internal Revenue Service does not favor the 661 divorcee. In 2026, the standard deduction for a married couple filing jointly provides a significant shield for retirement income. Once Barbara and Richard split, they are both pushed into the single filing status. This change often results in a higher effective tax rate on their individual incomes. Even more critical are the required minimum distributions, or RMDs, from their 401k and IRA accounts. Step by step, the math of the split becomes a nightmare. If a $2 million retirement portfolio is split into two $1 million accounts, each individual is still required to take distributions based on their life expectancy. However, because they are now single filers, a larger percentage of those distributions is captured by the IRS. The potential outcome is a hidden divorce tax that can deplete a retirement nest egg 20% faster than if the couple had stayed together. In response to these pressures, 2026 has seen the emergence of postmarital advocacy groups. These are highly organized political and legal organizations that are lobbying state legislatures to change how marital property is defined for those over 60. One of the most controversial movements is the push for Social Security splitting at the state level. Imagine a proposed law where a portion of a high earner's future Social Security check is legally garnished and diverted to the ex-spouse as part of the property settlement, bypassing federal restrictions. While this faces massive constitutional challenges, the fact that it is being debated in 2026 shows how desperate the 661 demographic has become to secure their individual futures. We are also seeing the professionalization of the divorce concierge. This is a new role in the 2026 legal industry, part paralegal, part financial planner, and part lifestyle architect. For Barbara, the concierge doesn't just help with the paperwork. They manage the transition of her entire identity. This includes the step-by-step decoupling of shared digital subscriptions, the splitting of family cloud storage, and the complex task of credit repair for a woman who has had no independent credit history for 35 years. In the United States of 2026, having your name on a joint mortgage for 3 decades does not automatically translate into a high individual credit score. Barbara finds that she is viewed as a high-risk borrower by the very banks that previously courted her and Richard as a unit. The 661 shift is forcing the American legal system to acknowledge a new type of poverty, the asset-rich, cash-poor divorcee. We are seeing case studies of individuals living in $700,000 condos, but struggling to pay for their monthly prescriptions because their liquid cash is tied up in the maintenance payments ordered by the court. The legal battlefield of 2026 is littered with these contradictions. The autonomy that Gary and Margaret sought in our earlier chapters has been achieved, but it has been purchased at the price of permanent legal and financial surveillance. As the courtrooms fill with 661 cases, the very definition of equity is being challenged. Is it equitable to leave a man with no way to pay for his assisted living because his pension is split? Is it equitable to leave a woman with no credit and a higher tax bracket after she spent her life supporting her husband's career? The 2026 legal system has no easy answers, only a series of complex trade-offs that are fundamentally altering the American retirement dream. But while the legal and financial costs are being tallied, a new industry is rising from the ashes of these dissolved marriages. If the 661 shift is creating a nation of millions of newly single, relatively affluent seniors, what happens when they decide to re-enter the world of connection? The next phase of this demographic revolution isn't about ending things. It's about starting over in a world that is radically different from the one they left in the 1980s. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to explore the new romantic economy of 2026. We will dive into the data on late-life recoupling and the emergence of the AI matchmaker, specifically designed for the 661 demographic. We will look at the case studies of third marriage startups and the surprising way that 2026 technology is creating a surge in high-speed remarriages. But there's a catch. The legal lessons learned in the first divorce are changing how these new relationships are structured. We'll uncover the rise of the life partnership contract and why the traditional wedding of 2026 is being replaced by something much more pragmatic and much more profitable for the legal industry. Stay tuned because the quest for love in the 661 shift is becoming the biggest business in America. The transition from the cold finality of the courtroom to the vibrant, high-stakes world of the 2026 romantic economy marks the second stage of the 661 shift. Once the assets are split and the individual is established in their new, downsized microdwelling, a new drive emerges: the pursuit of companionship without the systemic risks of the traditional nuclear family. In the United States of 2026, we are witnessing the rise of the vetting economy, a multi-billion-dollar industry specifically designed to facilitate late-life recoupling while protecting the hard-won autonomy of the silver splitter. This is not the dating scene of the 1980s or even the 2010s. This is a pragmatic, AI-driven marketplace where social capital and financial symmetry are the primary currencies. Imagine Janet, a 65-year-old retired healthcare administrator in Sarasota. In mid-2026, after 18 months of post-divorce recovery, Janet decides to re-enter the dating world. But Janet is not looking for a soulmate in the romanticized sense. She is looking for a lifestyle complement. She uses an application called Prime Match 2026, which is specifically integrated with her verified financial and health data. In this landscape, the historical trends of blind dates and serendipitous encounters have been replaced by a step-by-step verification process. Before Janet even sees a profile, the AI has already cross-referenced potential matches for creditworthiness, health compatibility markers, and shared legal philosophies regarding inheritance. The potential outcomes of this tech-driven approach are profound. We are seeing a decrease in the time to coupling for the 661 demographic, but with a radical shift in how those couples live. This brings us to the dominant social structure of 2026, living apart together, or LAT. Case studies from the last 24 months indicate that over 60% of 661 individuals who find a new partner choose not to cohabitate. Imagine Janet meeting Bill, a 72-year-old widower. They spend 4 nights a week together, they travel to Europe, and they share a deep emotional bond. However, they maintain separate residences, separate bank accounts, and separate legal identities. For the 661 demographic, the LAT model is the ultimate form of risk management. It provides the companionship they crave while ensuring that if the relationship ends, there is no second legal or financial catastrophe. The business side of this shift is staggering. In 2026, the luxury travel industry has completely pivoted to the coupled but independent model. We are seeing the rise of duo suites in high-end resorts, hotel rooms with 2 master bedrooms and shared living spaces, designed specifically for LAT couples. Furthermore, the legal industry has found a new profit center in the Domestic Partnership Charter. This is a document that is more robust than a prenuptial agreement, but less binding than a marriage license. It outlines the specific financial contributions each partner will make to shared experiences, the protocol for medical emergencies, and the explicit statement that neither partner has a claim to the other's estate or pension. In 2026, the romantic dinner often ends with a digital signature on a weekend-specific liability waiver. But we must also address the darker side of the 661 romantic economy, the hyper-sophistication of romance scams. As trillions of dollars in liquidated marital assets sit in the accounts of newly single seniors, they have become the primary targets of AI-generated predatory schemes. In early 2026, the FBI reported a record surge in deepfake courtship, where scammers use high-fidelity video and voice synthesis to impersonate romantic interests. Step by step, these predators build trust over months, eventually steering the 661 individual toward exclusive investment opportunities or emergency medical loans. This has led to the emergence of the personal security concierge, a professional Janet hires to vet the digital footprint of every man she meets. In the 661 world, trust is not given, it is audited. Now, consider the impact on the adult children once again. In our previous chapters, we discussed the inheritance anxiety felt by 30-somethings when their parents divorce. In 2026, that anxiety reaches a fever pitch when a 661 parent begins to date. Imagine James, who we met in part 4, watching his 68-year-old father, Robert, begin a serious relationship with a new partner. James is not just concerned about his father's happiness, he is concerned about the resource drain. Historical trends indicate that late-life recoupling often leads to a diversion of capital. Even if Robert doesn't remarry, the high cost of a new, active social life, international cruises, fine dining, and gifts, effectively burns through the remaining inheritance. This has created a new demographic friction point in 2026, the child vetting protocol. We are seeing case studies where adult children are demanding relationship reviews before their parents make significant financial commitments to a new partner. It sounds cold, but in the 2026 economy, it is a survival mechanism for the entire family tree. Some families are even implementing legacy protection trusts that trigger upon a parent's re-entry into the dating market, moving assets into a protected bucket that the parent can use for income, but cannot liquidate for a new partner's benefit. The 661 shift is also redefining the concept of social capital. In 2026, your value in the dating market is often tied to your network utility. Does a potential partner have access to a good medical team? Do they have a reliable social circle? Do they own a property in a desirable climate? The recoupling process has become a form of M&A, mergers and acquisitions, for individuals. Janet and Bill aren't just dating. They are merging their social and logistical networks to create a more resilient life in their 70s. This is a functional, almost biological approach to romance that the younger generations, still focused on passion and family building, find baffling. But what happens when this optimization fails? Even with the AI vetting and the legal charters, the human element remains unpredictable. In the 2026 landscape, we are seeing the emergence of the serial 661 splitter. Individuals who cycle through multiple LAT relationships, seeking the high of newness while avoiding the depth that leads to vulnerability. The psychological data suggests that for some, the 661 divorce wasn't a one-time event, but the beginning of a permanent state of transition. They have become professional individuals, perpetually optimizing their lives but never truly landing. The 661 shift has turned the final third of American life into a high-stakes adventure. The old script of winding down has been shredded and replaced with a script of scaling up. But as we look at the millions of Garys, Margarets, Janets, and Bills navigating this new world, we have to ask, what is the ultimate destination of this movement? If the traditional family is being replaced by a network of independent agents, what does the America of 2030 and 2040 look like? Are we building a more resilient society? Or are we creating a demographic bubble of isolated individuals who will eventually require a massive state intervention to survive? In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to synthesize everything we've uncovered. We will look at the ultimate forecast for the American family and the specific step-by-step strategies that the most successful 661 individuals are using to balance autonomy with security. We will explore the rise of the multi-generational compact, the only model that seems to bridge the gap between the 661 splitters and their anxious children. And finally, we will reveal the one statistical indicator that predicts whether a 661 divorce will lead to a golden reboot or a final crash. The conclusion of the 661 shift is not what you've been told, and it will change how you plan for the rest of your life. Stay with us for the final chapter. The ultimate forecast for the American family in the wake of the 661 shift is not one of total collapse, but of a radical high-efficiency reorganization. By mid-2026, we have moved past the initial shock of the Great Divorce explosion and entered the era of the strategic restructure. This is where the most successful individuals in the 661 demographic are distinguishing themselves from those heading toward a final crash. The difference between a golden reboot and a devastating financial and social decline often comes down to a single measurable statistical indicator: social capital velocity. This is the rate at which an individual can convert their existing network, reputation, and emotional intelligence into new, stable support systems post-dissolution. Imagine Benjamin, a 71-year-old former civil engineer in Denver. In late 2026, Benjamin represents the case study for the golden reboot. When his 45-year marriage ended, he did not simply walk away with half the bank account and a sense of bitterness. Instead, Benjamin engaged in what we now call the multi-generational compact. Step by step, he collaborated with his ex-wife, Clara, and their 3 adult children to treat the divorce as a corporate spin-off rather than a total liquidation. Historical trends in 2026 show that families who utilize this model retain nearly 30% more of their collective net worth over a 5-year period, compared to those who engage in traditional adversarial litigation. The first step in Benjamin's compact was the conversion of the family's primary asset. Rather than selling the large estate in a volatile 2026 housing market and losing 20% to taxes and fees, they executed an intergenerational equity agreement. They partitioned the property, creating a high-end accessory dwelling unit for Benjamin, while their eldest daughter moved into the main house with her family. This allowed Benjamin to maintain his lifestyle, stay close to his grandchildren, and keep the property's value within the family lineage. The potential outcomes of this strategy are revolutionary. It solves the isolation problem of the 661 shift, while providing the young generation with the housing stability they have been denied for a decade. However, the 661 shift also produces the final crash. Consider a different case study. Stephen, a 68-year-old in Florida who chose the path of total autonomy. Stephen liquidated everything, cut ties with his social circle to pursue a new life in a different state, and ignored the warnings about his social capital velocity. By late 2026, Stephen's data profile shows a sharp decline. Without the domestic labor and social gatekeeping of his former spouse, his health markers have deteriorated. His cost of living is 50% higher as a solo dweller, and his lack of a localized support network means that every minor crisis, a car repair, a flu, a tech glitch, requires him to pay a professional for help. This is the 661 poverty trap. The realization that solo independence in the 2026 economy is a luxury that quickly depletes even significant retirement savings. We must also look at the ultimate forecast for the American economy through 2030 and 2040. The 661 shift is currently triggering the largest transfer of wealth in human history, but it is happening in a fragmented way. As trillions of dollars are divided between aging individuals, the traditional investment models are being upended. We are seeing the rise of the individual sovereign fund. In 2026, high net worth 661 divorcees are no longer trusting traditional pension models. They are moving their assets into highly liquid, AI-managed portfolios that prioritize immediate cash flow for healthcare and lifestyle flexibility over long-term growth. The potential outcome is a massive shift in the stock market's volatility, as a demographic of millions of single seniors moves in and out of positions with unprecedented speed. The architectural landscape of the United States is also being permanently altered. By 2030, the 661 shift will have mandated the end of the traditional suburban sprawl. We are seeing the data-driven rise of ageless urbanism. This involves the construction of vertical neighborhoods designed specifically for the 661 demographic, buildings where medical care, social clubs, and flexible living spaces are integrated into a single ecosystem. Imagine a high-rise in Atlanta where the first 5 floors are dedicated to specialized geriatric wellness, and the upper floors are modular apartments for the silver splitter. This is the 661 response to the loneliness epidemic. It is a technological and social solution to a demographic problem that was once solved by the nuclear family. But what about the statistical indicator we mentioned? Social capital velocity. In 2026, we can now track this through digital interaction data. Individuals who maintain high levels of engagement with multi-generational groups, who volunteer, or who participate in the circular economy of care, we discussed in previous chapters, have an 85% higher success rate in their post-divorce life. The data is clear. If you enter the 661 shift with the intent to be a solo actor, your biological and financial clock will accelerate toward a crash. If you enter it as a network hub, you will likely experience the golden reboot. Step by step, the most successful 661 individuals are following a specific strategic framework. First, they prioritize the financial neutrality audit, ensuring that no legal decision is made without a forensic understanding of the long-term tax implications in a 2026 environment. Second, they execute a digital legacy plan, decoupling their digital lives with the same precision used for physical assets. Third, they establish a health-wealth integration plan, recognizing that their physical vitality is their most important financial asset. These individuals aren't just getting divorced, they are performing a high-level life audit. The 661 shift is the final evolution of the American individual. It is the moment where we have decided that the pursuit of self-actualization is the highest goal, even at the cost of the institutions that built the country. Whether this leads to a more vibrant, diverse society or a fragmented, vulnerable population remains the great question of the late 2020s. We are witnessing the birth of a new social contract, one where the family is a choice rather than an obligation, and where the home is a flexible node rather than a permanent anchor. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, you must realize that the numbers we have analyzed, the 661 demographic profile, are not just statistics. They are the blueprint for your future. Whether you are currently married, single, or navigating a transition, the economic and social gravity of this shift will pull at your life. The era of the stable middle is over. We have entered the era of the dynamic third act. You now have the data, the case studies, and the strategic framework to understand exactly where you fall on the spectrum between the golden reboot and the final crash. But there is one final hidden factor that we haven't touched on, a development in the 2026 medical field that is about to change the math of the 661 shift yet again. What happens to a divorce agreement when life expectancy suddenly jumps another 10 years due to cellular rejuvenation breakthroughs? How do you split a pension that now has to last for 60 years instead of 30? This is the longevity paradox, and it is the subject of our next deep dive series. If you thought the 661 shift was a shock to the system, wait until you see what happens when the finish line of life itself begins to move. The journey of the American family is only getting more complex, and we will be here to track every single heartbeat of the change. Prepare yourself, because the next revolution is already at your doorstep.